You carry the wine past silk-draped walls, careful not to spill a drop. The goblets are crystal, the floors are marble, the candles drip slowly in golden cages. Behind you, laughter echoes, thick, low, and private. A woman giggles, and the sound dies quickly, like a confession swallowed mid-sin. You're in the apostolic palace, but tonight it is no holy place. They call it the banquet of chestnuts, though no one will admit it by morning. The tables are set with roasted meats shaped like thighs, figs sliced open, glistening like tongues, fruit carved into phalluses, candied dates arranged in pairs of two, male and female, priest and penitent. The dancers are not dressed, the priests are not sober, and the man seated at the highest throne, robes parted slightly, rings too large for his fingers, is the Pope of Rome, Rodrigo Borgia, Alexander VI, the Vicar of Christ, and seated just below him, in a gown the colour of blood and gold, is his daughter, Lucrezia. She does not smile, she does not speak, but she watches. She's 18, maybe 19. Her hair is twisted with pearls. Her hands rest on her lap like someone being painted, not entertained. The dancers perform before her, not for her. Her father leans close when he speaks to her, brushing her shoulder with his lips. When he drinks from her goblet. No one stops him. No one dares. She is the Pope's daughter. But tonight, she is his moon, his consort, his witness. Before we descend further into this story, the church buried in incense and silence, if you believe history must not forget its darkest corners, I invite you to subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It matters because the walls of the Vatican stretched farther than they claimed, and what happened inside them shaped the world we still live in. By midnight, the dancers are crawling. 50 courtesans, some masked, some bare, slither across the banquet floor as gold coins are thrown among them. The Pope claps, red-faced. Cesare Borgia, his son, leans forward, licking wine from his wrist. He's beautiful, dangerous. Lucrezia watches him too long. The guests pretend not to notice, but they do. Servants move quietly, eyes lowered. No one speaks of what they see. A cardinal stumbles, muttering a blessing through vomit. A bishop unties his belt with trembling fingers. A nun walks past with bare breasts and a basket of figs. She is not a nun, not tonight. And Lucrezia, she remains still, not surprised, not afraid, only present. They say the Pope gave prizes to the man who could couple most often that night. They say Cesare won, that Lucrezia crowned him herself. No proof survives, only the letters, the rumours, the silence of the Vatican that followed. And silence in this house is the loudest truth. Because this was not a feast, it was a doctrine, a declaration, that there were no laws in Rome but power, that there was no sin too great when God himself wore robes that reeked of wine. And in the centre of it all, seated like the Virgin reimagined, was a girl with gold on her shoulders, whose only crime was being born to a man who thought himself untouchable. That was the beginning of her worship, of her ruin, of a story that would poison every room she entered for the rest of her life. She was born behind closed doors, not in a palace, but in a Roman townhouse, where secrets festered behind brocade curtains. Lucrezia Borgia, daughter of Vanozza de Catane, and Rodrigo Borgia, then a cardinal, not yet pope, but already dangerous. The church would not speak her name in public. She was a bastard. But not just any bastard. She belonged to the man who had become God's voice on earth, and that made her valuable. From the moment she could walk, Lucrezia's life was choreographed. Tutors, dressmakers, priests. She was trained to smile, to nod, to charm. Not for herself, but for Rome. Her beauty was not hers. Her purity, a commodity. Her bloodline, a tool. She was 10 years old when her father was elected pope. She was 11 when he married her off. To Giovanni Sforza, a noble name, a political alliance. Lucrezia's body was sealed with a ring before she understood what the word husband meant. The wedding was lavish. The Pope himself hosted the feast. Lucrezia sat beside him in a golden gown. He held her hand longer than was proper. The guests noticed, and so did her new husband. But the marriage was hollow, cold, political. Giovanni was older, resentful, outmatched. Rodrigo demanded obedience. Cesare watched too closely. Lucrezia remained a girl in a house of men with teeth. The whispers began early, that Giovanni could not perform, that he was impotente. Rodrigo, offended by this failure, moved quickly. He wanted the marriage annulled. But to annul a papal daughter's marriage, he needed a reason. He chose impotence, publicly. Giovanni was humiliated, dragged before the papal court, forced to sign documents that admitted his manhood was defective, that he could not please a child bride, that Lucrezia remained untouched, virginal, untainted. But she wasn't untouched. Not in Rome, not in that house. She had been touched by shame, by suspicion, by the kind of affection that comes too late and lingers too long. After the annulment, Rodrigo insisted his daughter remain in the Vatican, not in a convent, not in seclusion, but in the apostolic palace, at his side, the same halls where cardinals whispered of unnatural fondness, the same rooms where Cesare lingered outside her chambers longer than he should have, and Lucrezia, she said nothing, because silence was survival, and obedience was the only language the Church respected in its women. The Pope dressed her in silk stitched with pearls. He gifted her a jewelled dagger to guard her virtue. He had her likeness painted in his study, where visitors could not help but notice how her eyes mirrored his. She was daughter, diplomat, hostage. Every marriage proposal passed through her father's hands. Every suitor weighed not for love, but for leverage. When a Spanish prince flirted with her, Rodrigo sent him away with a sermon and a threat. When a German envoy kissed her glove, Cesare followed him into an alley the next night. He never returned. Lucrezia became the virgin Rome paraded and Rome feared. She could smile while being auctioned. She could curtsy while being traded. She had no choices, only roles. And each one led her closer to a bed she had not chosen, and a family she could not escape. She was the daughter of the Pope, but in truth, she was the bride of the papacy, offered, annulled, adored, and devoured. He was not ashamed of her. That's what made it worse. Most fathers of the time would have hidden a daughter like Lucrezia, beautiful, unmarried, caught between annulments and rumours. But Rodrigo Borgia, Pope Alexander VI, placed her in the centre of Rome, like a statue in his private cathedral. At feasts she sat beside him. At sermons she stood behind him. At diplomatic meetings she poured the wine and handed the scrolls, dressed in silks that clung too tightly for modesty. He touched her too often, too openly, not cruelly, not forcefully, but constantly. A hand on her waist that lingered half a breath too long. Fingers brushing her jaw when no one spoke. A kiss on the forehead that always found her hairline then trailed lower. He smiled when she blushed, as if the reaction pleased him more than her presence. The courtiers noticed. So did the priests. They never said it aloud, not directly, but in letters. Oh, the letters. Ambassadors wrote home to Spain and Venice with careful words. The Pope dotes unusually on his daughter. He grows jealous when others speak with her. He allows her freedoms no woman of the cloth, nor of noble birth, should possess. Lucrezia said nothing. Her gaze stayed level, her smile held. But behind the locked doors of the Vatican, she lived inside a portrait, framed, hung, and too watched to move freely. He praised her intelligence to visiting bishops. He described her skin in detail to foreign diplomats. Once he interrupted a cardinal mid-sermon to adjust Lucrezia's veil himself. The man never preached again. Some said Rodrigo saw Lucrezia not as a daughter, but as a symbol of his control, of his virility, of his God-given right to reshape Rome, but others said different things, that he was obsessed, that he watched her sleep, that he had her rooms redecorated to match the frescoes of Venus and Mars naked on the walls, that when she was ill he kissed her hands every hour, that he ordered her perfume reformulated to smell like the inside of a church, incense and myrrh, that no man touched her without his blessing, and that blessing always came with a warning. In public he was fatherly, but in private he was always nearby. Even the servants knew better than to mention her name too loudly. Even the eunuchs guarded her with attention that didn't come from modesty, but fear. No one wanted to be accused of looking at her too long, because the Pope was not like other fathers. He had no superior, no equal, no one to stop him. And Lucrezia, she lived with that knowledge every hour. There were no locked doors between their chambers, no chaperones, no rules, because he was the one who wrote the rules. She wore his crest around her neck, and when he drank too much he called her light of my life in Latin, lumen meum, not filia mea, never my daughter, just light. Even the artists knew. When they painted her portrait, they softened her features to match his. Same lips, same cheekbones, same strange sadness around the eyes. Rome didn't need scandal, it had truth. And the truth was this: Pope Alexander VI watched Lucrezia Borgia not as a father should, but as a man who had forgotten what the word father means. Cesare always walked too close to her, not just as a brother, not even as a bodyguard. He hovered like a jealous lover, one hand on his sword, the other tracing the air near her shoulder, daring anyone to look at Lucrezia the wrong way. And if they did, they didn't last long. Lucrezia Borgia was not just the Pope's daughter, she was also Cesare Borgia's sister, and that made her both invincible and cursed, because nothing in the Borgia family came without blood. Cesare was Rodrigo's golden son, a cardinal turned soldier, a priest who gave up the cloth to become Rome's executioner. He was charming, educated, handsome in the way lions are, beautiful until they bite. He rode through Rome like a prince from legend, in black armour polished to mirror. Children cheered him, enemies feared him, and women? Women watched him the way flames watch kindling, but the only woman who could calm him was Lucrezia. Their bond was too strong, too visible. Even the court poets noticed it. They wrote verses about forbidden twins in silk robes, about moonlight on gold hair and hands that lingered too long. Cesare gave Lucrezia gifts no brother should give: earrings shaped like serpents, daggers with her initials carved beside his. At feasts he fed her figs from his own fingers. When she laughed he stared, not in amusement, but in hunger. And when her second husband, Alfonso of Aragon, dared to touch her too gently, Cesare's silence turned to violence. Alfonso had been a good match, a prince of Naples, young, handsome, gentle. He loved Lucrezia, or at least treated her kindly, which in the Vatican was already a miracle, but Cesare hated him. He said it was political, Naples was unstable, Alfonso's loyalties were unclear, but everyone knew better. Cesare watched them too closely, counted how long Alfonso kissed her cheek, noted how often he visited her chamber. Then, one night in 1500, Alfonso was attacked on the palace steps, strangled, stabbed, left to bleed. He survived, barely. Lucrezia tended to him herself, sat beside his bed, weeping quietly as he drifted in and out of pain. Then, a week later, Cesare's men came again. This time, Alfonso was smothered with a pillow in the Pope's palace, while the guards turned away. Lucrezia said nothing. No one knows if she begged Cesare to stop, or if she turned her head and let it happen. Some claim she fainted, others said she was the one who unlocked the door. The truth was simpler. It didn't matter. Alfonso died. Cesare was never punished, and Lucrezia remained. She wore mourning black for months, but when Cesare returned from campaign later that year, they embraced too long in the garden. A servant swore he saw her whisper into Cesare's neck, "Now, there's no one between us." The servant vanished before morning. By then, the incest rumours weren't rumours, they were currency. French envoys reported them in letters. Spanish bishops whispered them in confession. Poets turned them into allegory. Even rival cardinals began calling her the Pope's whore and the sister bride. Lucrezia became myth, not a woman, not a sister, not a daughter, but a mirror, reflecting the Borgia family's sickness back onto itself. And at the centre, between two men who believed they owned her, she stood silent. Because to survive the Borgias, you didn't need truth, you needed silence. You needed to be what they needed you to be, even if that meant being passed between father and brother, like a secret too powerful to be spoken aloud. He was called the Infans Romanus, the Roman child, but no one could say who his mother was, and worse, no one could agree on the father. In the summer of 1498, a baby appeared in the Borgia household. No public birth, no official announcement, no celebration, just a child, wrapped in silk, carried into the palace in silence. Giovanni Borgia, they named him. He was not a secret, but he was never fully acknowledged. 2 papal bulls were issued by Pope Alexander VI. The first declared Giovanni the son of Cesare Borgia, an illegitimate heir, but legitimate enough for power. The second, issued months later, named Giovanni as the Pope's own son. Both documents bore the seal of the Vicar of Christ. Both could not be true, and Lucrezia, her name appeared in neither. But she had been secluded for months, removed from the public eye under the pretense of illness. A physician visited daily. A midwife was summoned from Naples. Then silence. When she reappeared, she looked thinner, pale. Her dresses hung differently. Her eyes stayed lowered. No one asked, because no one wanted to know the answer. The midwife disappeared shortly after the birth. A servant who had changed Lucrezia's sheets was reassigned to a distant monastery. Another was found drowned in the Tiber, her mouth stuffed with papal parchment. And the child, he lived. Not with Lucrezia, not with Cesare, but somewhere in between. Sometimes he called Cesare father. Sometimes he kissed the Pope's ring and called him padrone. But when he saw Lucrezia in the courtyard, he ran to her, arms open. No fear, no shame. Just that reflex all children have when they see the woman who brought them into the world. She never corrected him. Historians have debated his parentage for centuries. Some say Cesare seduced a maid and the Pope tried to protect him. Others believe Rodrigo himself fathered the child and used Cesare's name to hide the scandal. But the eyes were unmistakable. They were Lucrezia's, and they were the same eyes that stared out from her father's portraits. Too large, too knowing. The boy grew up under papal protection. He received land, a title, but never a place in the family tree. He existed like a painting without a signature, visible but never truly owned. And Lucrezia, she carried on, married again, traded like currency. But when news came of Giovanni's progress, his lessons, his health, his appearance, she always listened. She never claimed him, she never denied him. But when he fell ill once in the winter of 1503, she rode through the night to reach him, alone, without guards, without orders, because the truth, like her son, had never needed to be spoken aloud. Everyone already knew. They always closed the doors before. The Pope's feasts were notorious, wine-drenched, candle-lit, thick with laughter that didn't echo because the walls were too heavy with velvet and secrets. But on this night the doors remained slightly ajar, and what passed through them did not belong in a palace built to house God. It was the year 1501, a hot Roman night. A Spanish ambassador wrote the report. He had no reason to lie. His letter wasn't poetry, it was testimony. A quiet man, devout, shaken by what he saw through the open door. Inside the chamber, the Pope, his son Cesare and Lucrezia. No masks, no guests, no courtiers to blame for what followed. Just the three of them. No robes, no shame, no candles snuffed when footsteps approached. They did not stop when the ambassador passed. They did not even pause. Lucrezia sat on a velvet chaise. Cesare poured wine into her glass. She drank. The Pope kissed her hand, not with the forced formality of fathers, but with the aching slowness of someone who forgets where bloodlines end and desire begins. The ambassador's words were careful, but there was no ambiguity. He called it una unión prohibida, a forbidden union, and he wasn't the only one who saw. Servants in the corridor stepped backward. One of them dropped a tray. No one was punished, because no one had dared to enter. No one had interrupted the Pope, not even when the sin unfolding in that chamber echoed louder than any confession ever whispered inside a church. The church, after all, was his. He was the church. And if God watched that night, he said nothing. This was not rumour. This was not myth scribbled by enemies. This was witnessed, described, sealed in diplomatic reports and preserved in family records. The men who wrote it were not seeking scandal. They were recording it, horrified and helpless. What made this night different wasn't what happened. It was that they didn't bother to hide it. As if, for once, the Borgias forgot to pretend. The papal crown had been too heavy for too long, the robes too soaked with guilt, and maybe Alexander VI stopped believing he had to answer to anything but his own desires. Or maybe he wanted them to see how close power and pleasure could sit together, to see a dynasty that had replaced God with itself. Cesare did not flinch. Lucrezia did not hide. The Pope smiled, and the door remained open. For centuries, historians tried to scrub the record. Some claim the ambassador exaggerated, others said he mistook what he saw. But the same event appears again, reworded, repeated, always re-emerging. Because it wasn't just a private act. It was a ritual, a coronation of the family's sickness, a moment when incest became liturgy and blasphemy became legacy. And the church stayed silent. No excommunication, no penance, no punishment. Because to punish the Pope was to admit that even God's voice could be poisoned. Lucrezia never spoke of that night. Neither did Cesare. But after it, something changed in Rome. The whispers grew sharper, the paintings became darker, and the people, clergy, nobles, peasants, began to fear not just the Pope's sin, but the Pope's example. Because if the holiest man in the world could take his daughter as a lover, then who among them was safe, and who among them was still innocent? That was the night they didn't close the door, and history has never been able to look away since. She left Rome at dawn. No procession, no farewell from the Vatican balconies, just a small, tightly guarded carriage rolling over the Tiber Bridge, carrying the Pope's daughter away from the only city that had ever known her name. They said it was a marriage, her third, this time to Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, a nobleman with a cold jaw and a colder court. His family resisted. They had heard the rumours. They called her a harlot, a poisoner, a papal pawn soaked in incest and scandal. They only accepted the match after Alexander VI offered an obscene dowry and promises of influence no other alliance could deliver. But the question lingered long after she crossed the city gates. Was she escaping? Or had she been quietly cast out? The Vatican never admitted either. Officially, it was an honour, a political union, a celebration. But the palace emptied after her departure. Cesare didn't follow. The Pope didn't send letters, and Lucrezia, she didn't look back. The moment she arrived in Ferrara, the difference was clear. There were no feasts, no poets singing her beauty, no indulgent father pressing lips to her forehead. The halls were colder, the candles dimmer. She was not adored, she was inspected. The Duchess of Ferrara, her new mother-in-law, called her that Roman. The courtiers bowed stiffly, never warmly, and Alfonso, her new husband, treated her with wary politeness, like a gift that might explode if held too tightly. But Lucrezia was no longer a girl. She had learned silence in Rome. She had survived papal lust, brotherly obsession, and the birth of a child whose name was never spoken. She had learned how to listen, how to watch, and most of all, how to transform. In Ferrara, she became what Rome had never allowed her to be: a woman, not a symbol, not a vessel, not a daughter draped in someone else's sins. She dressed modestly, spoke softly, donated to convents, hosted poets and theologians. She became a patron of art, a figure of grace, and slowly Ferrara began to forget what the world once whispered. But Lucrezia didn't forget. Every letter from Rome went unopened for days. When word reached her that Cesare was growing erratic, she made no reply. When the Pope's health began to fail, she stayed silent. Some say she cried in private, others say she burned their portraits. But one fact remains: she never returned. Not for her father's funeral, not for her brother's downfall, not for the boy she had once cradled in secret and left behind. And maybe that was her rebellion. Not poison, not revenge, not scandal, but distance. Because in a world ruled by men who mistook desire for love and power for piety, the most radical thing a woman like Lucrezia Borgia could do was walk away. When Pope Alexander VI died in 1503, the bells of Rome rang slowly, more from obligation than grief. No masses were interrupted by mourning, no pilgrims wept openly in the streets. The air around the Vatican felt lighter, the city exhaled, and behind closed doors the church went to work. They burned papers, they reassigned servants, they changed locks and sealed rooms with wax. Everything that bore the mark of the Borgia name was quietly removed, not erased, just forgotten. His death was suspicious, of course. Most claimed it was malaria. Others whispered poison, intended for someone else but swallowed by the Pope himself in a cruel turn of fate. Whatever the cause, his body decayed so quickly that even the priests recoiled. The corpse blackened, the stomach swelled grotesquely. Servants refused to carry him. Guards covered their faces with cloth, a fitting end for a man whose sins had rotted the church from within. Cesare, once the Vatican's golden sun, tried to hold on to power, but without his father's shadow. He was just another man with enemies. He was arrested, exiled, eventually hunted through foreign lands like a diseased prince without a kingdom. And Lucrezia? She remained in Ferrara, far from Rome, far from the rot. The new Pope, Pius III, made no mention of her. No accusations, no apologies. She simply ceased to exist in the Vatican's memory. The Church never addressed the incest, never acknowledged the child, never condemned the feasts, the rumours, the open doors. Instead, they buried the evidence under marble tombs and Latin blessings. A few brave cardinals tried to raise questions, but they were silenced or sent abroad. Some were poisoned, some simply vanished into monasteries where no letters ever arrived. It was easier to canonize the silence than confess the truth. The official papal records made no mention of what Lucrezia had endured, or what she had been forced to become. Instead, she was listed only as the daughter of Pope Alexander VI, married to Alfonso d'Este. No scandals, no shadows, no sins, just another entry in a list of noble alliances. The Vatican cleaned its hands, with incense, with revision, with holy water poured over stained marble that would never shine quite the same again. And the world moved on, but the whispers never stopped. Centuries later, historians would dig up the papal bulls, the ambassadors' letters, the poems too vivid to be fiction. And they'd realise something terrible. that the Vatican's greatest crime wasn't what it allowed, but what it covered. Because somewhere inside those sealed rooms, beneath gold ceilings and painted saints, Rome had watched a father take his daughter, and a church had done nothing but dim the lights and close the door behind him, and then they cleaned their hands and called it holy.